Before we dive into this powerful story, don't forget to subscribe to the Brave Animals channel. Here we bring you heartwarming stories of loyalty, courage, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a moment that could change your life. It was the kind of morning that felt like the world was holding its breath. The sky, a dull stretch of gray, loomed over the quiet town nestled in the heart of rural America. Frost clung to the grass like tiny shards of glass, and the cold bit through the air with an unforgiving sharpness. The old farmhouse on the edge of town seemed frozen in time, a relic of simpler days. But that morning, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Something that would shake the town to its core and remind everyone what it means to be a family. Max, a retired K9 German Shepherd, walked faithfully by the side of his owner, Ernest Miller. Ernest, a weathered farmer in his late 60s, had the kind of hands that told stories. Calloused, strong, yet gentle. His boots crunched against the frozen ground as he carried a pail of feed toward the barn, while Max sniffed the air. His ears pricked in alertness. Without warning, Max stopped. His body stiffened, a ripple of tension running through him. His nose twitched, catching a scent that didn't belong. His gaze locked onto the tree line at the edge of the field, dark eyes narrowed and unblinking. Ernest followed Max's line of sight, heart skipping a beat. In the stillness of the morning, a faint sound drifted on the breeze, a soft, almost imperceptible whimper. Max bolted. Ernest stumbled forward, his breath puffing in the cold air, calling after the dog. But Max was already gone, his paws tearing, through the frost-covered grass weaving between bare trees like a shadow. Ernest's legs burned as he tried to keep up, but age had slowed him, and Max's determination was unmatched. When Ernest finally caught up, he found Max standing rigid, tail high beside a battered cardboard box nestled between two scrubby bushes. Max's body trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a fierce, unspoken urgency. His eyes flicked to Ernest, then back, to the box, as if pleading for action. Ernest dropped to his knees, breathless. His hands fumbled with the soggy flaps, pushing them aside. What he saw punched the air from his lungs. A baby, swaddled in a thin, damp blanket no bigger than a loaf of bread. The infant's skin was pale, lips bluish, and his tiny fists clenched tight against the chill. The weak, gasping cries barely rose above the rustle of the leaves, fragile as the last ember of a dying fire. Max lay down beside the box, pressing his body close, sharing his warmth. His eyes, deep and steady, reflected something more than instinct, something that looked an awful lot like love. A soft whimper escaped his throat, low and pleading, as if begging Ernest to save the fragile life trembling before them. Ernest's hands trembled as he scooped the baby into his arms. The child's body felt weightless, frighteningly small against the rough fabric of Ernest's old flannel jacket. His heart thundered in his chest, the shock of the moment sinking in. Who would leave a baby out here, in the freezing cold? What kind of desperation or cruelty led to this? Before he could process the thought, a sharp clatter of hooves snapped his attention to the field. Spirit, his aging but sturdy white horse, trotted toward them, nostrils flaring in the icy air. The horse lowered his head, warm breath misting over the baby's face, and something remarkable happened. The child's eyes fluttered, a tiny, quivering breath escaping his lips, followed by a wail, a stronger, louder sound than before, as if the warmth of the animals had sparked a fading flame back to life. Ernest stared, caught between disbelief and awe. His farm animals, the loyal companions of his quiet rural life, were standing guard over this abandoned child. Max nudged closer, resting his chin against the baby's legs, while Spirit snorted softly, watching from above. It felt like the earth itself had conspired to save this baby, as if fate had chosen this moment, these creatures to rewrite a story that had almost ended in tragedy. Word spread quickly through the small town. A baby found in a field, rescued by a dog and a horse. Neighbors arrived, their arms full of blankets, bottles, and questions. Who was this baby? Why had he been left in the cold, alone? The questions hung in the air like the smoke rising from Ernest's chimney. But while the town whispered and speculated, Max remained at the baby's side, refusing food, keeping constant watch. Spirit lingered near the porch, a sentinel in the misty mornings, peering through the window to check on the tiny bundle swaddled in old blankets. Ernest named the boy Lucas. The old farmhouse, once silent and worn, began to fill with a different kind of noise. Soft coos, the creak of the rocking chair, the sound of Max's claws clicking on the wooden floor as he paced back and forth, always guarding. Neighbors brought what they could: baby formula, extra diapers, casseroles for Ernest. There were still questions, still an edge of curiosity mixed with concern. But under it all, there was something undeniable. A community was forming around this small miracle. Each night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Ernest would sit with Lucas in his arms, Max at his feet, and Spirit just outside the window. He would rock slowly, humming old tunes from forgotten days, telling Lucas stories about the stars, the fields, the beauty of life when you take a moment to listen. And though Lucas was too young to understand, his little hand would wrap around Ernest's finger, holding tight. It was in those quiet moments that Ernest felt it, an overwhelming sense of purpose, of belonging. He didn't know where the baby had come from or what his story was, but in that little house on that cold farm, they were a family. Not because of blood, but because love had found them all, in the most unexpected way. And for Ernest, Max, Spirit, and the little boy they had saved, this was only the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, but they had each other, and sometimes that's all you need. Life on the farm settled into a quiet, steady rhythm, but nothing about it felt the same anymore. The arrival of little Lucas had transformed the once silent farmhouse into a place of laughter, cautious steps, and small everyday miracles. Ernest, who had spent years tending the fields and fixing fences in the stillness of his own thoughts, now found himself chasing after a baby's needs, learning to warm bottles instead of coffee, and watching Max stand guard with a loyalty that went beyond words. Max, the aging K9, had taken to his new role like it was a mission he had been waiting for his whole life. He rarely left Lucas's side, resting his head on the crib during the night, his eyes half open, ever watchful. If Lucas cried, Max would gently nudge Ernest awake with a soft whine, pacing near the crib until the baby was soothed. It was as if Max understood that this little boy, abandoned and fragile, was now their responsibility. Spirit, too, seemed to understand. The old white horse had become a quiet guardian of the farmhouse, standing near the windows, peering in as if counting every breath Lucas took. When the baby began to sit up, reaching out his tiny hands toward the glass, Spirit would nuzzle close, exhaling warm puffs of air onto the window, fogging the glass as if to say, "I'm here too." The neighbors in town couldn't stop talking. The news of a baby found in the field, rescued by a dog and a horse, had spread like wildfire. At the general store, over cups of hot coffee, people whispered their theories. Some thought the baby had been abandoned by a young mother who couldn't care for him. Others speculated darker stories, maybe a runaway from a bad family situation. Nobody knew for sure, and Ernest, while grateful for the extra diapers and formula left on his porch, wished they'd just leave it be. All that mattered was that Lucas was safe. He was here, and he wasn't going anywhere. There was a moment, about 2 weeks after Lucas had arrived, that Ernest would never forget. It was a cold morning, with frost still clinging to the fence posts and the air crisp enough to make your breath puff out in white clouds. Ernest had bundled Lucas in a thick blanket and taken him out to sit on the porch, hoping the fresh air might help settle the baby's fussy mood. Max sat beside the rocking chair, head on his paws, watching the sunrise, while Spirit nibbled at a hay bale in the corral. Lucas wriggled in Ernest's arms, eyes wide, tiny fingers gripping at the edge of the blanket. Then out of nowhere he let out a soft gurgling sound, almost like a laugh. Ernest froze. That sound, it was the first real laugh he had heard from the baby. It was small, barely a bubble of air, but it was there. Max's ears perked up, his tail thumping once against the floor. Spirit lifted his head, ears twitching toward the sound. Ernest's heart swelled so full he thought it might burst. That was the moment it hit him. This boy wasn't just some abandoned child they had stumbled upon. He was family. Their family. But even as the warmth of new beginnings filled the house, a shadow lingered in Ernest's mind. He couldn't shake the memory of that figure he had seen lurking in the trees that night. Who was that man? Was he connected to Lucas? Was he planning to come back? Ernest started locking the doors at night, something he hadn't done in years. He double-checked the windows, kept the porch light on until late, and slept with the old hunting rifle propped up against the wall. Max was on edge, too, more alert, ears flicking at every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside. Spirit would stomp in the corral at night, snorting, as if he sensed something in the dark. One night, just as Ernest was about to drift off in his chair by the fire, Lucas snug against his chest, Max lifted his head sharply, ears forward, body tense. A low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest. Ernest's heart jolted. He carefully set Lucas down in the crib, grabbed the flashlight from the side table, and crept toward the window. Outside, beyond the yard, the trees swayed in the cold wind. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, and there, just for a second, Ernest saw him. A man, standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the branches, watching the house. His face was shadowed, but Ernest could see the glint of his eyes in the light. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like a statue carved out of the night. Ernest felt Max press up against his leg, growling low and steady. Spirit let out a sharp snort from the corral, stomping the ground with a sharp clack. Ernest's finger twitched over the flashlight switch, his mind racing. Then, as quickly as he'd appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the darkness. Ernest didn't sleep much that night. The next day, he walked into town, straight into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Daniels, a no-nonsense kind of man with a belly that strained against his uniform and a thick southern accent, listened quietly as Ernest explained what he had seen. Daniels nodded, making notes in a little notepad, but Ernest could see it in his eyes. He didn't think much of the story. Probably just a drifter, the sheriff said. Someone passing through, maybe looking for food or shelter. But Ernest knew better. That man wasn't just passing through. He had been watching them, watching Lucas. Back at the farm, Ernest doubled down. He reinforced the old fence with extra boards. He started carrying the hunting rifle when he walked the property. Max followed him everywhere, his body language sharp and on edge. Spirit seemed restless, pacing in the corral when the sun dipped low. The farmhouse, once a place of quiet peace, now felt like a fortress on alert. But even in the tension, there were moments of light. Lucas's first steps came on a Sunday afternoon, with the sun streaming through the kitchen window and Max barking excitedly as Lucas wobbled toward him, arms outstretched. Spirit poked his head through the window to see what the fuss was about, and Ernest, standing there with tears in his eyes, felt something break open inside him. A mix of fear, love, and fierce protectiveness. They were a family now, forged in the cold, tested by the unknown. Ernest knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, they'd have to face whatever storm was brewing beyond the woods. But for now, they had each other. They had the farm, the fields, the warmth of the fire, and the bond that had grown strong between a man, a dog, a horse, and the baby who had brought them all together. And as Ernest rocked Lucas to sleep that night, Max resting at his feet and Spirit watching from the window, he whispered a promise into the quiet. No matter what comes, I'll protect you. We'll protect you. Always. It had been a few weeks since Ernest had spotted the man near the woods, but the image of that shadowy figure lingered in his mind like a bad storm cloud refusing to drift away. Every creak of the porch, every gust of wind rattling the shutters at night made Ernest's heart race. Max, too, had grown more watchful. His ears were always up, eyes darting toward every sound, ready to protect. Spirit was restless, pacing the corral with sharp, impatient snorts. They all felt it. Something was coming. But in the daylight hours, life on the farm carried on, as if the world hadn't shifted beneath their feet. Lucas was growing fast, his once tiny hands now clumsy and curious. He had learned to toddle, across the wooden floor, Max at his side like a fluffy shadow. Sometimes Lucas would grab Max's ears and laugh, and Max would sit patiently, his eyes soft, accepting every tug, every giggle as if it were a gift. Spirit had become more than just a horse. He was part of the family. Lucas loved to toddle out to the fence where Spirit would lower his head, allowing the boy's small hands to pat his broad nose. Ernest often found them like that. Max lying nearby, Lucas giggling, and Spirit standing, tall, his breath steaming in the cool morning air, watching them all with a calm, knowing gaze. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ernest sat on the porch, watching the leaves swirl across the yard. Lucas was on a blanket in the grass, playing with a stick and an old coffee can, completely absorbed. Max lay a few feet away, eyes half closed but ears still twitching while Spirit grazed lazily near the fence. It should have been peaceful, perfect even, but the unease in Ernest's chest never really went away. He took a sip of coffee, the mug warm in his hands, and tried to shake off the worry. Maybe the man had moved on. Maybe it was all in his head. Then it happened. Max jolted upright, ears sharp and body stiff. Spirit let out a snort, stomping his hoof hard against the ground. Ernest's stomach twisted as he followed their gaze, straight to the edge of the woods. There, half hidden by the trees, stood the man again. This time, Ernest could see him more clearly. His clothes were ragged, a torn jacket hanging off his shoulders. His face was pale, with sunken eyes and a beard that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in weeks. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets and he stared, not at Ernest, but at Lucas. A chill ran through Ernest's bones. He stood, careful not to make any sudden movements, and called out, his voice steady but low. "What do you want?" The man's shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked like he might run, but then he took a step forward. Just one, his eyes shining with something Ernest couldn't quite read. Regret, maybe. Or guilt. Max growled, the sound deep and rumbling like distant thunder. Spirit's ears flattened, and he took a few heavy steps toward the fence, nostrils flaring. The man raised his hands slowly, palms open, like a man surrendering. He spoke, but his voice cracked, barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know what else to do." Ernest's heart pounded in his ears. He took a step forward, gripping the porch rail so hard his knuckles went white. "Who are you?" The man's eyes dropped to the ground, his breath hitching in his chest. When he spoke again, it was barely audible. "He's mine. I had to leave him. I thought someone better would find him." A sick, heavy silence settled over the yard. Ernest felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. Max barked, once sharp and loud as if trying to break the tension. Lucas, unaware of the storm brewing around him, babbled happily, waving the stick in the air. The man's gaze softened as he looked at the boy. A tear rolled down his cheek, carving a line. Through the dirt on his face, I couldn't keep him safe. They were coming for me, for us. I had no choice. Ernest's chest ached. He wanted to be angry, wanted to shout at this stranger for abandoning a baby in the cold. But looking at him, thin, hollow-eyed, broken, he saw a man drowning in mistakes, in fear, in a life that had spiraled too far out of control. "You can't come back here," Ernest said, his voice low and firm. "You need to leave. Now." The man nodded, shoulders slumped in defeat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a worn wooden charm shaped like a star, smoothed by years of handling. He placed it gently on the fence post and backed away, disappearing into the trees without another word. Ernest picked up the charm, turning it over in his hands. It felt warm, like it had been carried close to the heart. He didn't know what to make of it, but he slipped it into his pocket, unsure of what else to do. That night, Ernest sat in his chair by the fire, Lucas sleeping soundly in the crib, Max curled up nearby, and Spirit standing at the window like a sentinel. The weight of the day pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. He looked at Lucas, this boy who wasn't his by blood but felt like his in every other way. He thought about the man's face, the desperation in his eyes, the raw pain etched into every line of his body. It wasn't an excuse, but it was human. Max let out a soft, tired sigh, and Ernest reached down to scratch behind his ears. "Spirit," snorted softly, shifting his weight as if to say, "I'm here too." For a long time, Ernest just sat there, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady sound of Lucas's breathing. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing with certainty. He would protect this child. No matter what. Out there in the darkness, there might still be danger, unanswered questions, maybe even threats. But inside the farmhouse, there was love, there was loyalty, there was family. And as the wind howled outside, Ernest felt a quiet resolve settle deep in his bones. They had survived so much already. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The days on the farm stretched into a rhythm again, but it wasn't the same kind of peace Ernest used to know. It was the kind of quiet where you kept an eye on the woods, where every snap of a twig made your heart skip a beat. The man who'd come for Lucas hadn't returned, but his absence left a weight behind, an invisible thread of tension woven through every hour of the day. Max felt it too. He barely let Lucas out of his sight, trailing, behind the toddler like a bodyguard. If Lucas crawled too close to the fence, Max would gently nudge him back, a soft but firm reminder. Spirit, ever watchful, would position himself nearby, a towering figure of calm, lowering his head to Lucas when the boy reached up to pat his nose. Lucas was growing fast. Too fast, it seemed. His little legs, once wobbly, now carried him across the yard with a determination that made Ernest smile and sigh all at once. The boy's laughter filled the farmhouse like sunlight through old windows, and Ernest found himself stopping, sometimes in the middle of chores, just to watch. Watching Lucas laugh, watching Max play along, watching Spirit lift his head to the wind as if he too could feel the change in the air. The neighbors still talked. At the diner, over plates of biscuits and gravy, they'd whisper about the man. In the woods, about the baby who'd been left behind. Some folks thought it was a miracle that Lucas had been found. Others called it a curse, warning Ernest that trouble might come back around. Ernest didn't have answers for them. He only knew that the boy was his to protect, and no amount of gossip would change that. One crisp Saturday morning, Ernest took Lucas into town for the first time in weeks. He bundled the boy in a little flannel jacket and a knit hat pulled down over his ears, loading him into the pickup truck while Max jumped into the bed, tail wagging like a flag in the wind. Spirit stayed behind, watching the truck roll down the gravel driveway, his breath puffing in the cold air like smoke. At the general store, folks greeted Ernest with cautious smiles, glancing at Lucas like he was part of some folk tale they weren't. Sure, they believed. Mrs. Carter, the woman who ran the bakery, bent down to offer Lucas a cookie. Lucas grinned, crumbs sticking to his cheeks, and Ernest could feel the weight of the eyes around him. Curious, questioning, but softening at the sight of the boy. It wasn't until they were loading groceries into the truck that Ernest felt that cold, gnawing unease crawling up his spine. Max froze, staring across the street toward a dark sedan parked at the corner. The windows were tinted and the engine idled low. Ernest followed Max's gaze, his stomach tightening. A man sat behind the wheel, face obscured by shadows, eyes hidden by a pair of dark sunglasses. He didn't move, didn't even pretend to look away. Max growled, deep and steady, his fur bristling. Ernest's hands trembled as he loaded the last bag into the truck bed, then quickly lifted Lucas into the cab, his heart pounding like a drumbeat in his chest. He climbed behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Max leaped into the bed, his gaze locked on the sedan. Ernest started the engine and pulled onto the road. The sedan didn't follow, not immediately. But in the rearview mirror, Ernest could see the glint of its headlights idling in the same spot, like a shadow waiting for its chance. Back on the farm, Ernest couldn't shake the feeling. That night he sat at the kitchen table long after Lucas had fallen asleep, the charm left by the man still resting in his palm. It felt warm, almost alive, like it held some kind of story he couldn't quite understand. Max sat by the door, ears pricked, watching the dark outside as if daring it to try something. Spirit paced the corral, his hooves striking the ground in a restless rhythm. The horse seemed to feel it too, that sense that something wasn't right, that the calm they had found was only temporary. Days passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Ernest reinforced the barn doors, checked the locks on the windows twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. Max patrolled the house like a soldier, never straying far from Lucas's side. Spirit stood by the fence line, watching the horizon like a sentinel carved from stone. Then, one foggy evening, just as the last light of the sun was fading, Ernest heard it. The sharp, unmistakable sound of tires crunching gravel. He stood up, so fast the chair toppled over behind him. Max was already at the door, barking low and steady, his body rigid with tension. Ernest grabbed the old hunting rifle from its place by the stove, heart hammering in his chest. Through the window, headlights glowed faintly in the thickening fog. The same sedan. Ernest could feel the pulse in his throat, hot and pounding, as he stepped out onto the porch. Max stood beside him, growling, while Spirit let out a sharp, angry snort from the corral. The car didn't pull all the way up the driveway. It stopped halfway down, engine idling. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then the driver's door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. A man, tall and thin, shoulders hunched against the cold. Ernest could barely make out his face, but he knew. It was the same man. The father. He didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't come any closer. He just stood there, his face pale and pinched, as if the weight of the world had carved deep lines into his skin. Then, without a word, he turned and got back into the car. The sedan reversed down the driveway and disappeared into the fog, swallowed by the night. Ernest let out a shaky breath, lowering the rifle. Max whined softly, leaning into his leg. Spirit stood quiet in the corral, ears flicking back and forth, as if waiting for something to happen. That night, Ernest couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, Lucas in his lap, Max at his feet, Spirit peering through the window, and stared into the flames until they blurred into shapes he couldn't name. The man had come back. But why? What did he want? And how long before he tried? Again? One thing was clear. This wasn't over. Ernest leaned down, kissing the top of Lucas's soft hair, and whispered a promise into the dark. No matter what happens, we're going to be okay. I'll keep you safe. Max will keep you safe. Spirit will keep you safe. You're ours now, and we're not letting you go. The fire crackled low, the night thick and quiet around them. Outside, the world might be full of danger, but inside that farmhouse they had each other, and Ernest knew in his bones that sometimes family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one you build, piece by piece, moment by moment, heart by heart. And whatever came next, they'd face it together. The days grew shorter as winter settled in, wrapping the farm in a soft, gray hush. Ernest could feel the cold in his bones when he woke in the morning, stiff and sore from nights spent in the rocking chair. Lucas cradled against his chest. Max never left the boy's side. Spirit, too, seemed to stand watch more than he slept, his breath curling in the cold air like smoke signals. The memory of that car in the fog lingered, pressing down on Ernest like a weight he couldn't shake. He knew the man would be back. It was only a matter of time. And when he came, Ernest didn't know if it would be for a quiet visit or something far worse. Lucas, though, was blissfully unaware. He had learned how to toddle on unsteady legs across the worn floorboards, giggling as Max followed close behind, sometimes tripping over the boy's enthusiasm. He loved to sit by the window and watch Spirit, his little hands slapping against the glass when the big horse walked by. Ernest found comfort in those moments, watching the boy's eyes light up with wonder at the world outside, even while the edges of that world seemed darker than ever. One evening, just after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the sky burned with streaks of orange and pink, Ernest sat at the kitchen table, turning the small wooden charm over in his hands. It had become a habit, picking it up, rubbing, his thumb across the smooth surface, wondering what the man had meant by leaving it behind. Max lay nearby, his ears twitching at every creak of the old farmhouse, while Lucas sat in the high chair, smearing mashed potatoes across the tray with both hands. Ernest couldn't help but smile at the mess, but the smile didn't last long. A knock on the door, soft but deliberate, snapped his attention up like a whip crack. Max was on his feet before Ernest could blink, barking with a sharpness that sent a chill down Ernest's spine. Spirit let out a loud snort from outside, pawing at the frozen ground like he was ready for a fight. Ernest stood slowly, heart thudding in his chest. He moved to the door, the rifle leaning against the wall within reach. His fingers brushed the handle, but before he could open it, a voice called out. Low, rough like it had been scraped raw by wind and regret. Please. I'm not here to hurt anyone. Ernest opened the door just a crack, enough to see the man standing on the porch, his breath fogging in the cold air. He looked thinner, more worn than before, his jacket pulled tight around him, shoulders hunched. His eyes, though tired, held something Ernest hadn't expected, something like desperation. I just want to talk. Max growled deep in his throat, a warning, but Ernest lifted a hand to calm him. He stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him, his boots crunching on the frosty porch boards. The man looked down at his feet like he couldn't bear to meet Ernest's gaze. I know you don't trust me, the man said quietly. I don't blame you, I wouldn't either. But I need you to know, I never meant to leave him like that. I didn't know what else to do. They were after me, and I thought leaving him in a place where someone might find him was the only chance he had. Ernest's jaw clenched. The wind bit at his face, but the cold wasn't what made him shiver. He thought of Lucas sleeping soundly inside, safe, at least for now. You left a baby in the freezing cold, Ernest said, his voice sharp but steady. You left him to die. The man flinched like the words had cut him. I know. God, I know. And I'll never forgive myself for it. But I wasn't just running from a bad situation. They were coming for me, for him. People who don't take no for an answer. I thought they'd stop if they didn't know where he was. I thought maybe you could keep him safe. Ernest stared at him for a long moment, the words settling in like cold stones in his gut. He wanted to hate this man, to drive him off the property and tell him never to show his face again. But he couldn't. Not entirely. There was a weight in the man's voice, a quiet kind of grief that Ernest knew too well. The man reached into his pocket, slowly, carefully, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out, his hand trembling. I wrote him a letter. In case I don't make it. Ernest hesitated, then took it. The paper was worn soft at the edges like it had been carried for a long time. You need to leave, Ernest said firmly. Don't come back here. If you care about that boy, you'll stay far away. The man nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. Without another word, he turned and walked off the porch, disappearing into the dark, leaving only the sound of his boots crunching across the frozen earth. Inside, Ernest sat back down at the table, the letter shaking in his hands. He didn't open it. Not yet. Lucas babbled softly in the high chair, smearing food across his face, oblivious to the weight pressing down around them. Max lay back down, but his eyes stayed open, locked on the door, ears twitching. Spirit let out a long, low sigh outside, pawing the ground once before settling back into his usual stance by the barn. That night, Ernest lay awake long after the fire had burned down to embers. Lucas snuggled against Max in the corner of the room, soft breaths filling the space. Spirit stood outside in the moonlight, a white silhouette against the dark. Ernest stared at the letter, folded and heavy in his palm. He thought about the man's words, about the shadows creeping closer, and about the life they'd built here, fragile but fierce. He knew the danger hadn't passed. Not yet. But as he looked at Lucas, peaceful in sleep, and Max, ever loyal, and Spirit, strong and steady outside, Ernest felt a stubborn, burning resolve settle deep in his chest. No matter what came, they were going to face it as a family, because family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's the ones who choose to stay, the ones who fight for you even when they're afraid, the ones who stand guard in the dark and keep you safe. And Ernest. Miller? He was ready for whatever came next. The first snow of the season dusted the farm like powdered sugar, soft and quiet, settling into the cracks and crevices of the old porch, the fence posts, and the roof of the barn. The world seemed to hold its breath under that blanket of white. It was peaceful in a way, but Ernest Miller couldn't let himself relax. Not fully. Not with the weight of that letter still tucked away in the drawer by his bed, and the memory of that man's hollow eyes lingering in his mind. Life on the farm kept moving, though. Lucas was growing stronger, his little legs now sturdy enough to chase after Max, his giggles echoing through the crisp winter air like music. Max, ever the protector, followed a step behind, his tail wagging and his eyes sharp, ready for anything. Spirit, steady and calm, had become Lucas's favorite companion. The boy loved to sit on the fence rail, reaching out to brush his small hands through the horse's mane while Spirit snorted softly, standing perfectly still. Ernest watched these moments with a tightness in his chest. He loved the boy. There was no question about that. But the question of what would come next gnawed at him every night as the wind howled outside. He kept the rifle close, checked the locks twice before bed, and left a light on in the kitchen. The letter the man had given him stayed folded unread. Ernest wasn't sure if he was afraid of what it might say or if he already knew deep down and just wasn't ready to face it. One evening, as the sky turned a deep, glowing blue and the stars started blinking into view, Ernest sat on the porch, with a mug of coffee warming his hands. Lucas was asleep inside, his soft breathing filling the quiet room. Max lay at Ernest's feet, his ears twitching with every distant sound. Spirit stood near the corral fence, watching the dark fields, like a sentinel. It was then that Ernest saw them. Two sets of headlights appeared on the far road, moving slow, deliberate, the tires crunching over frozen gravel. His stomach sank. This wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't a casual visitor. Max was on his feet in an instant, his body rigid, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Spirit pawed the ground, snorting as if he could smell the trouble coming. Ernest set the coffee down, his hand steady but his heart pounding in his ears. He slipped inside, locking the door behind him, and pulled the rifle from its place by the stove. He peeked through the window, watching the cars roll to a stop at the edge of the property. Figures stepped out, 3 men bundled in heavy coats, moving like they knew exactly where they were going. Ernest's gut told him the truth, before his mind caught up. This was about Lucas. The man's warning, the charm, the letter, it was all connected. He took a breath, deep and steady, and whispered to Max, "Stay close, boy." Max growled, his body tense, and moved to stand between the door and Lucas's room. Spirit let out a sharp, high-pitched whinny, stomping so hard the frozen ground seemed to shiver. Ernest stepped onto the porch, the rifle raised, his voice steady as he called out, "You need to turn around and leave. Now." The men paused, glancing at each other. The tallest one stepped forward, his voice calm but cold. "We're not here for trouble, sir. Just here for what belongs to us." Ernest's grip on the rifle tightened. His voice cut through the cold like steel. "There's nothing here that belongs to you." Behind him, Lucas stirred in his crib, a soft whimper drifting through the air. Ernest's chest tightened. He had no time for fear now. Max let out a bark, sharp and fierce, standing his ground like a soldier ready for battle. Spirit kicked the fence, the crack of wood splintering under his hooves, breaking the night's stillness. The men hesitated, shifting uneasily. Ernest could see it in their eyes. This wasn't going to be an easy win for them. He didn't blink, didn't lower the rifle. Max didn't move an inch. Spirit let out another loud, angry snort, tossing his head. Finally, the tallest man sighed, a sound of frustration, and motioned for the others to back off. They retreated slowly, their eyes darting between Ernest, Max, and Spirit, like they were calculating the risk of pushing any further. When they reached the vehicles, they got in without another word, engines revving as they sped off into the night. Ernest didn't lower the rifle until the red glow of their taillights had disappeared, completely. His breath came out in ragged bursts, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. Max let out a low bark, then moved to nudge Ernest's leg gently, as if asking if it was really over. Spirit finally settled, pawing the ground once before lowering, his head in relief. Inside, Ernest checked on Lucas, who had fallen back asleep, unaware of the storm that had just passed him by. That night, as the fire crackled low and the wind rattled the windows, Ernest sat in the rocking chair with Lucas in his arms, Max curled up nearby, and Spirit visible through the window, standing calm and steady in the moonlight. The world outside was still, dangerous, still uncertain, but in that little farmhouse there was a different kind of peace. A fragile one, maybe, but real all the same. He finally opened the letter. The man's handwriting was messy, scattered, but the words were clear. He wrote about regret, about running from the wrong people, about trying to protect Lucas by letting him go. He asked for forgiveness, knowing he didn't deserve it. And, at the end, a line that stuck in Ernest's heart. Please, if you can, give him the kind of life I never could. Let him be free. Ernest folded the letter back up, tucking it away. He looked at Lucas, asleep in the soft glow of the fire, and made a silent promise to the boy who had come into his life on a cold morning, wrapped in nothing but a blanket and a hope for something better. You're safe here, kid. We've got you. No matter what comes, we've got you, because family isn't just about blood or names or who came before. It's about the ones who show up, the ones who stand their ground when it matters, the ones who protect each other in the storm. Life isn't always easy. Sometimes it throws you into situations you never expected, asks you to be stronger than you ever thought you could be. But in those moments, you find out who you really are. What would you do if you had to protect the ones you love, no matter the cost? And when life hands you an unexpected family, would you fight to keep it?